Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy. You're reading with Jimmy. This is the analysis of The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. What a story. Boy, did the third person narrator set us up for that ending or what? Hopefully you read the story with me. If not, please go back and read it. Before we dig into The Lottery, I wanted to give you a bit of background when it was published in 1948 in the New Yorker magazine. I know it's important to analyze a story by staying inside the story. That's what Jimmy tells you all the time. Stay inside the story. If you're going to prove something, you got to have evidence inside the story. Everything we read on this website involves analysis of what's inside the story. And inside the story, there's two types of narrator: first person, who's also inside the story, and the third person narrator, who's outside the story, telling us the story. So when we do analyze a story, whether it's a novel, a drama, or whatever, we're going to stay inside of it. But in this case, I wanted to add a touch of the reaction of what happened when this appeared in the magazine. It'll help you understand and appreciate the story, which is essentially about rituals. If you didn't read it yet, please go back and read it. But if you did read it, it's a pretty interesting story, would you say? But it's about a ritual. So we're going to talk a lot in this analysis about what a ritual is, what a ritual isn't. But you can research for yourself what happened when it appeared. But to give you an idea, many readers were disturbed by the way the story was portrayed in what looks like senseless violence in an ordinary rural American setting. In the calm, everyday tone of the narrator, who's third-person narrator, it contrasted with the violent conclusion. Now, the narrator, third-person narrator, did this for a reason. We don't ever talk to the narrator, and the narrator, third-person narrator, never tells us, even the first person never tells us why he's telling us what he tells us. But part of our analysis is to understand that reason he's doing this, the narrator, third person, he or she. According to reports at that time, many readers felt unsettled, maybe some today do as well. I was talking to my niece this morning, who is a lawyer in Chicago, and she immediately remembered reading the Lottery in college. She didn't remember the specifics, except she did, and the specific was the stoning. But the impression it left with her, it was very disturbing. She was disturbed by the story. The reason you feel like that is because of the way the narrator, third-person narrator, tells us the story. It's pretty calm until the ending when they stone Tessie. However, if you're a careful reader, you'll pick up very early that something is interesting and different about this town. We'll talk about that. So the story has a kind of symbolic nature. We're going to talk about symbols and rituals throughout this analysis. The New Yorker magazine reported back then, that it received a record number of letters from readers, many of which expressed anger, disgust, confusion. Remember, in 1948, there were telephones, but the main communication vehicle was newspapers and writing letters. When you didn't like something, you wrote a letter. When you want to communicate with a friend in a different city, you wrote a letter. Today, who writes letters anymore? You send emails, right? But in those days, you wrote a letter. So they would write letters to the editor, and it was very different than it is today. Shirley Jackson, the author herself, received hate mail threatening her life. Some people canceled their subscriptions. I'm canceling my subscription to the New Yorker. This is disgusting. So sometimes when you write a story or publish a story, you generate reactions like this, right? Rather than, oh, this is boring. Some people say, a negative reaction like this is sometimes as good or better than a positive reaction. Well, in total, from my research, hundreds of letters were sent according to the magazine, most which were negative. Readers were demanding an explanation. You can see this happen when you read Wall Street Journal articles, for example. Wall Street Journal allows comments like many other digital quote unquote outlets do, media outlets. They involve conversations between readers with the author, between each other. And you can look at any story that generates either a lot or a little conversation. Sometimes the more people who comment on it, the more debate there is about the meaning of the story. Jimmy participates sometimes in conversations with authors on Wall Street Journal articles. So readers were demanding an explanation and clarification of the story's meaning. If you read with Jimmy, in other words, if you read what's on my website and you read with me, you would know the meaning of this, not only because of when we finish the analysis, I'm going to give you some interpretations to consider, but careful readers will notice as they read, there's clues. So if you're a trained reader, you can figure it out. Probably what most disturbed these people was the setting. It's peaceful, close-knit community of Americans. It sounds like an American story, though it doesn't say it takes place in Ohio or anything. And they associated it with their own lives at the time. And just look at the first sentence. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of the full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. Isn't that beautiful? I think that's just beautiful. Puts you right in the mood. And then, of course, they start gathering stones. That's one of your clues as a careful reader. What's going on with the stones? You should have asked yourself when Jimmy was reading that, or at least it should have entered your consciousness. So the unexpected stoning for winning the lottery shocked these people and made them uncomfortable. If they did realize it about ritual and tradition, it made them question the nature of tradition and ritual and conformity. And that's what we're going to be doing in here, is thinking about rituals, traditions, and questioning them. Another fact that I found out is that some readers actually speculated whether such lotteries were real, and a few, according to the New Yorker, even asked where they can go to see this. Dear editor, can you tell me where I can, which town is this? I want to go see a stoning. This reminded me of the Mercury Theater production of The War of the Worlds that Orson Welles put on in 1938, 10 years before Shirley Jackson published her story. I don't know if you know who Orson Welles is, but you should Google him. And then you should Google The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, or Google Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. There's actually a movie made about this as well. At that time in 1938, the primary way of communication was radio. Television was not invented. If it was, only one person had it. And even radio, it took many years for everybody to have radios. But by 1938, many people had radios, and they would listen every night to music and news and programming, right? Well, Orson Welles had a thing called Mercury Theater, where he would put on plays. He would write scripts. Orson Welles was a very famous actor, producer, writer. Citizen Kane is his excellent movie. In any case, he put on a production of War of the Worlds where they started the play that they were going to dramatize. And then he interrupted this for news, and he pretended that Martians were invading. It's really an excellent broadcast. I'm sure you can Google it and hear it. But what he did is he interrupted his program as a pretend newscaster, and he started broadcasting The War of the Worlds, which is H.G. Wells' story about a Martian invasion. And he was so realistic, and everything he was talking about and the way he produced it. Because remember, you're only listening. Like when you're reading with Jimmy, you're not really looking at anything except the words. But in radio, you're only listening. So you're using, like when you read with Jimmy, your imagination, which is your most powerful tool. And Orson had a way of convincing people that they were actually being invaded. It's an amazing series of events that happened, and he had to finally come on the air and disclaim it and say, oh, no, I'm sorry, we were just acting. A lot of people got ticked off about that. I don't know if he was sued. But anyway, that's what this reminds, if somebody wrote a letter to the New Yorker and asked if they could see a village or a town like this, you have to really realize that there are some people who will believe anything, right? I mean, even if you believe this, why would you ask to go see it unless you're, a masochist? No. Even today, the lottery delivers unexpected ending, and only by careful reading, you won't be so shocked. So let's examine what the heck is going on. So here's the first piece. We're going to go over this in a minute. This is third-person narration. You never know who the narrator is. They're outside the story, telling us about the story. I hope if you've been reading with Jimmy for a long time, you know the difference between third person and first person. First person, someone inside that story would be telling us the story. Couldn't be Tessie. Why? Well, she was stoned, right? But it could be one of the townspeople talking to us, but it would be a very, very different narration. So the third person narrator is outside the story. It would be different. In a few sentences, you find out that they're doing something called a lottery. Now, normally the word lottery has a different meaning than the winner getting stoned to death, right? But in the beginning, the narrator tells us that the town in the story it takes only 1 day for the lottery, less than 2 hours because there's less than 300 people. But in some towns, you see, it will start the day before, right? It will start, they can start earlier on the 26th, before the 27th, because there's more as people grow, there's more people. And the ritual that they go through has to take up and involves everybody in the town, So it sets that up in the first few sentences. Everything is set up. There's a lottery going on. So what's so special about the 27th? That's a question that I asked that you should ask. Is there anything special about the June 27th? Well, it's around the beginning of summer, right? It's around the beginning of summer solstice. And some people think that date holds significant symbolic weight. But it's never really explained. The third person narrator never says, it's the first day of summer. Never says that. And if you look up what summer solstice is, it's not June 27th per se. So, since it's never explained, Jimmy recommends ignoring the symbol of this date, unless whether or not you think it has or hasn't significance, we have to stay in the story. Well, Jimmy, I remember something, just as Jimmy does. Of course you do. The narrator doesn't give us anything except one clue. There's one clue that might help us understand this date. That's when Old Man Warner says, used to be a saying about the lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. That's the only clue that you have to connect this to agriculture, to doing something, a sacrifice, because we know she gets stoned to death, right? But that's the only clue you have in this story. And you should go back and reread it. Prove Jimmy wrong, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Email me. But that's the only clue we have that something is connected to agriculture, is what the old man says. And used to be is a key expression because maybe it's not that way any longer. The one thing you should learn about rituals by reading this story is that they change. We're going to prove that about the wooden box in a minute. So it used to be a key expression. He says it used to be, maybe it's not anymore. But in any case, it sounds like it's one of the clues that connected to agriculture of a ritual sacrifice. That's one of the clues to make you believe that when they stone Tessie, they're sacrificing, they're killing her to make sure the corn is heavy, that the crops come in. So if that's the case, if you believe that, you don't have to believe that for this story to make sense about a ritual, but it's a clue. And I think the third-person narrator, he doesn't give us this clue. He has the old man Warner narrate the clue. He says this. So we have to believe the third-person narrator. The reason you believe the third-person narrator is if you don't, none of the story makes sense. Now, if old man Warner were narrating the story, it would be totally different. And I think you yourself, using your key imagination, because remember, whenever you read with Jimmy the Classics, your biggest asset is your imagination. It would be a totally different story. And I invite you to try to write it as if you were old man Warner. You might take a different swing at the ritual. In any case, Jimmy thought it's advisable to go back and look at ritual sacrifices and have a little idea of what they were. Now, you may or may not know this. You may or may not care to look at what that means, ritual sacrifices. But if you're going to read and appreciate classical literature, remember, understanding and appreciation are the key to this, to learn how others lead their life and how you should lead yours. And I'm not saying learn how to stone people. What I'm saying is to learn about rituals. And the more you bring to a story, the more varied background you have, the more rich you have in classical literature, the more richness you have in studying literature and culture and all that, the more you have of that, the better off you are in understanding stories, classical stories like The Lottery. Well, Jimmy, I don't believe it's a classic. That's your right. This is my website, and it's a classic. The reason it's a classic is because Shirley's done. Not only that, when you read it, it's a powerful story about ritual, isn't it? Powerful story. Any case, these sacrifices around agriculture have been around for a long time, and rituals are usually connected to religions. Usually, not all the time. So the sacrifice were often intended to ensure fertility, gods of harvest, good harvest, favorable condition, all three. I thought you would like a few examples of ritual sacrifices so that part of the reason is that you're not as shocked at the stoning of Tessie. I'm not condoning it. I'm not saying, they're doing this for whatever reason. I think they're executing the ritual of stoning someone for perhaps agricultural reasons, perhaps not, but ritual becomes a habit. And as Dostoevsky says, man gets used to everything. So the Aztecs were in central Mexico. They believed that human sacrifices were necessary to appease the gods, so they would kill people. They would kill mainly children, and they would perform ritualistic killing of children. And there's a movie, Apocalypto. If you haven't seen that movie, you should watch that movie. It's an excellent translation of what the Aztecs did. Now, Jimmy, that's really brutal, that we're killing children to make the crops grow. Agreed. But that's what they did. So I'm not saying, if you're going to understand literature like The Lottery, you got to put your morals aside for a moment. Just like whenever we read a classic piece of literature, you can't bring your stuff into the book, into the story, into the poem. You got to just read it for what it is first, and then you can make your judgment. Is killing children to raise crops immoral? Probably. Yes. But then again, if you're an Aztec living in 1325 or, 1400, and it's not. That's what they did. You see what I'm saying about the relative nature? Greeks did it. Greeks sacrificed to the god Demeter. She was a goddess of agriculture and harvest, and they would kill animals, mainly pigs, and they would put them in a pit to promote the fertility of the earth. Well, pigs are a lot better than killing children, Jimmy. Well, unless you're an animal rights activist, then it's still not right. Although there's a lot of religions that don't like pork. Not a lot, but there's some. Incas in South America worship this god, Inti, and they would sacrifice llamas. They would kill the llamas and sometimes human beings. There are many more. Egyptians did it. Celtics did it. Mayans did it. Sometimes they killed animals or humans. But in other words, throughout history, cultures have practiced ritualistic sacrifices for favorable conditions. Did it help grow crops? Doubtful. Personally, as a logical guy, if you say I kill a llama and that's going to help my crops grow, logically I would say you're probably wrong, right? Unless you have definite evidence that killing a llama will help your crops grow. Now, if you killed pigs and threw them into the ground, into the pit, and that creates fertilizer, for example, when Jimmy would go fishing and he would clean the fish, he would bury the guts into his garden, and that would act as fertilizer. It would draw bugs and worms and make. When I at a certain area where I lived before I moved, I had black gold. I had earth so rich in nutrients that I could grow fava beans. I'm telling you. So burying fish guts in your garden is good. It's like composting waste when you compost vegetable waste and turn it into fertilizer. Doesn't always smell right, but there it is. So I'm just saying, to make crops grow, I don't think you have to kill a llama. But depends on your culture. If you think about the lottery, the townspeople follow a similar kind of ritual if you believe Old Man Warner, right? Lottery in June, corn heavy, right? What does he say? Lottery in June, corn be heavy soon, if you believe that. Jimmy doesn't believe that because Jimmy doesn't believe that ritualistic killing of people benefits anybody. But we're going to talk about that. Obviously, the people in the lottery didn't mind it, except Tessie when she said it was unfair. Well, because she won the lottery. So, summary. The story takes place on June 27th when a small town conducts an annual lottery that culminates in a ritualistic sacrifice of the winner. It is being practiced by all towns, including some that are supposedly stopping the practice. I hope you caught that. It ends with Tessie, one of the characters, getting stoned to death. That's basically the plot, right? That's pretty much right. And then, well, Jimmy, why didn't we just read this instead of the story? Because you're missing the point of classical literature. In classical literature, every word means something. Right? What did I tell you Ezra Pound defines literature as? Do you remember? Send me an email, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, if you remember that. I'll tell you what he said. Language charged with meaning. Literature is language charged with meaning. If you read this story with Jimmy, I don't care where you live in the United States or anywhere in the world, you will never, ever again, when you hear the word lottery, think of a lottery meaning anything else than this story. I'm telling you right now. Well, it's lottery in Arizona or whatever. It's a $3 billion Powerball. Well, it's a lottery. And if you rent the lottery, you might win the $300 million. But you're not going to, that word lottery now forever is changed in your mind by reading this story. That's what Ezra Pound meant. It's language charged with meaning. The word lottery now leads to ritual. The word ritual means for you to start questioning what is and what is not a ritual. Jimmy loves Aristotle. Have you realized that yet? If you've been reading with me for a while, every story I read, I discuss plot and Aristotle. So this footnote is always here. You can read it for yourself. So plot, according to Aristotle, is plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song. That's the elements of tragedy. The elements of tragedy. Plot, character. Plot and character are the most important. Plot's the most important. Characters, right? the second most important. They're primary. You need a plot and you need good characters. The plot represents human action. There is activity throughout the story and a heavy dose of action at the end. That's in this story, The Lottery. So according to Aristotle, plots can be simple or complex. Jimmy believes The Lottery is a simple plot. Aristotle likes complex plots. Why? Because they involve something more, recognition, and they involve, you'll see here, a change of fortune that emerges from events preceding it, the final outcome because of it. But in a simple plot, the final outcome is after it happens. The hero's fortune moves in one direction and ends in catastrophe with no reversal. There's nothing to change his mind, to do anything. I'm going to explain that in a moment. And Tessie's the winner of the lottery, but is she also the hero? Is there a hero in this story? Who is the hero? Can you say with definity, with anything definite that Tessie's the hero? Because she did win the lottery, Jimmy. Yeah, but she got stoned to death. Is there a hero? What's the hero? Well, does the hero have to be a human being? I'm just asking. I'm not saying it's one way or the other, but the hero in this story is the ritual itself. But we'll talk about that. The reversal is in your mind. Lotteries usually mean you win something beneficial, but this is a reversal, and it's really winning. You get to die. Wow, you get to die. Complex plot, there's a change of fortune, and there's a reversal and recognition, or both. Everybody knows what's going to happen when you win this lottery in this town. Everybody knows what's going to happen. Even though Tessie objects at the end, this is not fair. You didn't give him enough time. Remember her yelling at that and Mr. Summers, right? It doesn't matter. They all knew what's going to happen if you pick that black dot. If you pick the dot, the paper with the dot, you're going to get stoned to death. So it's really not complex. It's a pretty simple plot told very simply by the third person narrator, but it doesn't have catharsis. What is catharsis? Aristotle described this as purging of emotions of pity and fear. Purging. And he gives a couple of examples. Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, the Odyssey, right? There's reversals. Well, Jimmy will read these one day, but there's no reversal here. There would be a reversal if suddenly Mr. Summers says, well, today, Tessie, you're not going to be stoned. In fact, you're going to become the next mayor. That would be a reversal. It would be unexpected. It would be a crappy story. So everything follows logically, right? But there's no character development. These are kind of almost not mindless characters, but mindless. So the characters aren't really developed deeply, are they? They go through motions, rituals, but we don't get to know much about them. That's why I think this is a simple plot. Pardon me. So Aristotle also said that a plot has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it does. This takes place in 2 hours on June 22nd, more or less. So at the beginning is their call to action, the lottery. They gather for the lottery. The middle is where they have the lottery. And then the end is when they stone Tessie. Narrator and insights. Let's talk about that for a moment. So the first few paragraphs put the plot in motion. We looked at this. So this is third person narrator. It's a beautiful summer day, blah, blah, blah. And then the story goes on after this, the story goes on to introduce a few of the characters. Here they are. The children come first, and they have American sounding names. They didn't say exactly which town this is. They didn't have a name of the town. They were assuming it's America, and I don't think it's a mistake to assume that. But it was published in the New Yorker. It could be in Transylvania if you want. It doesn't really matter. But they have American sounding names. Bobby Martin, right? Harry Jones. Dickie Delacroix, Mr. Summers, the guy who's running the lottery. These are American-sounding names. So we can conclude that like a regular town, because that's the narrator's trying to tell us that this is a regular town. Comments on Bobby Martin having stuffed his pockets full of stones. So you see the note when we were reading? Jimmy wrote a note for you. What's up with the stones? He tried to call your attention to this right away. Followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones. He'd already done that. Well, why is he doing that? Why? Those are questions that should enter your consciousness and say, why is he doing that? Something is different. He's stuffing his pockets with stones. Is that what kids do? Sometimes they do. Jimmy used to do that. Okay, so he's doing that, but then you read that there's a great pile of stones. Eventually, the villagers pronounced the name Delacroix, right? Harry Jones and Dickie have made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square, and they guarded it against raids of the other boys. So the boys are playing, oh yeah, we got to steal the stones. But there's stones are important. We don't know why yet. The narrator never tells us why. But if you read the story, then that's why going back and analyzing is always important. And that actually allows us to see the third-person narrator's motivation and how this story is being told to us. They could have told us why. Imagine if the narrator, third person, had said the big pile of stones in one corner of the square for the stoning of the winner of the lottery. What if the narrator said that? Well, then there it is. Now you're reading the story differently, right? But if you don't know that the winner is going to get stoned, you read the story differently. Well, Jimmy, who decides how the third-person narrator should narrate it? Well, the author, of course, right? But you cannot say that the third-person narrator is Shirley Jackson. Remember, slapping your hand, Jimmy said never conclude that the author is the third-person narrator. If you really want to know why, read any of the third-person narrator stories in Jimmy's website, on Jimmy's website. You never can conclude that the author is just the writer, but the narrator is the omniscient, godlike narrator telling us this story in the way that the omniscient narrator wants to tell us the story for us to understand and appreciate it. So, keep that in mind. Careful readers will keep the fact of the stones in mind and let the narrator just tell us that. Well, why doesn't he tell us that, Jimmy, right up front, that they're going to stone somebody? Because he doesn't want to. And you're not the narrator of the story. You want to narrate the story? Go write your own story and tell it your way. You see what I'm saying? There's a reason why the narrator do this. Can you guess why? Shock value. Shock value, right? You don't expect this unless, what's going on with the stones? Even if you said that, you don't expect Tessie to get stoned. You just don't, which is great. Not that she gets stoned, but great that you don't expect it. It's a kind of mystery, right? Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. This is a very important sentence towards the end when they're ready to stone Tessie. Read this again. Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual, and they've forgotten the ritual. In other words, they don't know why they're doing this. The third-person narrator right here, is telling us they've forgotten the ritual. They don't even remember anymore why they're doing this. They're just doing it. I want you to think about that. Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original, there's a lot of discussion about the black box. They lost the original box. They still remembered to use stones. You understand? They still remembered to use stones. Aha. So stones were part of the original ritual, but they forgot it was a ritual. So we have to believe the third person for this to make sense. And that's why Jimmy says this story is about rituals, finding out what a ritual is, knowing when to follow a ritual and when to break a ritual. That's what this story is about. That's what enriches your life, when you can understand what a ritual is and why you should follow or break it. Very, very important, because we all follow. As John Locke says, you're born with a blank blackboard. And then as you grow up, some people start writing on your blackboard. This is this, this is this. And one day you wake up and say, and you start saying, why do I believe this? Why am I doing this? And you'll always trace it back to somebody wrote it on your blackboard. Somebody told you to do this. It came through habit. Or my parents always told me to do it this way. Or I have to go to Thanksgiving dinner. It's a ritual. It's a tradition. Tradition and ritual are very close in meaning. The point of the story is for you to question this. This helps you erase your blackboard and write down your own, which actually will give your rituals much more meaning than these people in this story who don't even know they're following a ritual. They're just killing people. They don't even know why they're doing this. They're just doing it, which is probably the worst kind of ritual. So, like all third-person narrators, we have to follow what the narrator's saying. So then we see men and women gathering. They smiled rather than laughed. This is a little important point. What do you think that means? Smile rather than laugh. Laughed. What do you think that means? Do you know the difference between smiling and laughing? So they smiled. The narrator says this. They smiled rather than laughed. They're not laughing. They're smiling. So you can smile and not be happy, can't you? Can't you? Maybe that's what's going on here, because they know the outcome of the winner of the lottery. The women show up. It's kind of a town gathering. They're lining up in some kind of order, aren't they? Women by their husbands, children in order of age. So there's a ritual of why they're doing it. They don't know why they're doing it, but they're lining up in some type of order. And then we start to learn about the lottery details. Mr. Summers leads the ritual. Some sympathy for him is pointed out by the narrator because he has no children. And you know from having read the story that children participate in the ritual as well, right? They're part of the lottery. And people feel sorry for him because he has no children. So it's him and his wife who's described as a scold. Jimmy defined that for you. A person who grumbles all the time. And then there's the wooden box, a central component of the ritual. That box comes in. And Jimmy defined what a ritual is here. We're going to define that again for us later. So we learn about the box, a lot about the box. There's a lot of words devoted to the box by the third-person narrator. All right? How does knowing about the box help our understanding of events in the story? So you have to think ritual. If you're going to figure out why, if every word is necessary and classical literature, every word is necessary and has meaning, why does the third-person narrator spend so many words on this box? Well, because it's part of the ritual. It's part of the ritual that they don't remember, but every year after the lottery, Summers began talking about a new box. He wanted a new box. And every year the subject was allowed to fade off. Why does he want a new box? Because the old box is getting old. Because so much of the ritual had been forgotten or discarded. There's more proof. So much of the ritual has been forgotten or discarded. In other words, there were more parts to this ritual that are not narrated. The third-person narrator is telling us this, that parts of this ritual have been forgotten or have been thrown out, discarded. They don't do it anymore. Summers had been successful in having slips of paper substituted for chips of wood that had been used for generations. So this has not been going on for a year, for 10 years, for 20 years. This has been going on for generations. And during those generations, paper has been substituted for chips of wood, which is what they used to. This is the third person narrator helping us understand how rituals change. The narrator tells us what Summers did the night before the lottery. Why does narrator tell us? Because it's part of the ritual. There was a great deal of fussing done before, right? There were lists to be made up. You had to make a list. Heads of families, heads of households, in each family, members of each house. So everything was like a census. They took a census. And that's true because one guy doesn't have, he broke his leg, so his wife has to draw for him. You remember? So when Tessie shows up, there's a little scene that the narrator describes, and people are stirred back into position. So everybody's in position. There's positions. You line up, stirred back into position. And then old man Warner's comments are a tell. I want to just spend a minute on this. They do say Mr. Adams said to Warner, who stood next to him, over in the North Village, they're talking of giving up the lottery. There's a clue. They're going to give up the lottery. Now, remember, at this point, we don't know what that means. We don't know the lottery it results in stoning, but there talk about giving it up. So old man Warner snorts. You know the difference between snorting and saying, right? He snorts. Pack of crazy fools, he said. Listening to the young folks, nothing's good for them, good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves. Nobody work anymore. Live that way for a while. And work's important in this, right? Because Mr. Summers, after the lottery is done, he says, let's finish this quickly. We got to get back to work. These are workers. They work. But I don't know if that means living in caves, what that means. Used to be a saying. Now remember, this is the third person narrator narrating what Warner says. And there's the saying, first thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. That's when you can't get real food. There's always been a lottery, Warner says petulantly. Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking. Like he's offended that Summers is joking with everybody. In fact, he's not joking. He's just talking. Some places have already quit lotteries. Mrs. Adams. So Mr., Mrs. Nothing but trouble in that, old man Warner said. Pack of young fools. He thinks youth is a result of this. Then he keeps calling the people. So this is important to understand what ritual is, what's happening in this story. And when Tessie wins, the ending comes up quickly. All right, folks, after she wins, let's finish quickly. And they do. Here's the ending of the story. Although the villagers have forgotten the ritual, blah, 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 the piles of stones was ready. The stones on the ground were blowing, scraping the papers. Delacroix selected a stone, well, so large, blah, 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 blah. The children, I can't run, blah, blah, blah. They're all running, they're going to stone her. Tessie was in the center of the cleared space by now, and she held her hands up desperately. It isn't fair, she said. A stone hit her in the side of the head. Old man Warner was saying, come on, everybody. Right? He's like, oh, a savage. And then it isn't fair, it isn't right. And they were upon her. It's a sad ending, right? She gets stoned to death. It's not easy to kill with stones. So the interpretations are interesting about rituals, right? But the real thing you want to think about is rituals in your own life and whether you follow them or break them. So since the story is about rituals and we agree that this is probably an interesting story and we'll never think about lotteries again in the same way, rituals have been an integral part of human life and found everywhere. They're all around us, and we're going to talk about where they are. They're often unconscious. Again, they're on our blackboards, but we don't even know we're doing them. I'm going to give you many examples of this. So in the story, do the people realize it's a ritual? No, of course not. There's evidence that they don't even know why they're doing what they do. So they forgot. But is it a ritual? Of course it is, and I'm going to prove it to you. So why do they follow it? Why, if they don't know what it is, why are they doing this? Well, Jimmy, I think they're just crazy. That's one explanation, but I don't think it's true. You're going to see when we talk here, a lot of people can be construed as crazy for following today's rituals, right? Well, we have evidence that some towns are stopping it. So some towns are starting to question it. At least that's the rumor. But following or breaking rituals is really the key to helping us understand the story and about our own lives. So what is a ritual? It's a prescribed series of actions, words, or symbols performed in a specific sequence. X, Y, Z, followed, right? Often with symbolic or spiritual purpose. Kind of like a tradition. Rituals have actions, objects, and words, and or words. So to be a ritual, you got to have some action, you got to use some objects, and you got to use some words, right? Like if you look back at some of the examples we gave of sacrificial rituals for human sacrifice and animal sacrifice, they had actions, they killed things, they used objects, probably an altar or knives or whatever, and words. They probably had some sayings around it while they were killing their llamas. That represents something other than reality. That's what these things do. They represent something other than reality. And when something represents something else than reality, it's called symbolic. It's a symbol. For example, an owl might symbolize intelligence. So if when you think about an owl, you think, oh, that's a smart bird. Don't ask me why owls became associated with intelligence, but they did. Jimmy wrote a great poem. We'll talk about Jimmy's poem about the owl later on. Not that I'm saying it's a classic. It's not, but it's fun. Owls are a symbol, or a rose. You give your sweetheart roses to tell you the flowers. If Jimmy makes a mistake or something, he brings flowers to Mrs. Rose means love, right? It's love. Those are symbols, but they're not a ritual. It's not a ritual. Rituals involve actions and words. Well, Jimmy, if I bring flowers because I screwed up to my wife or my partner, and I repeat, I love you, isn't that a ritual? Well, if you screw up a lot and you have to bring flowers a lot, Jimmy would suggest that it becomes a ritual. Let me give you a better example. Catholicism, it's a type of religion. Many rituals are connected to religions, regardless of religion. Doesn't matter what religion we're talking about. I picked this because I'm very familiar with this. The sign of the cross to a Catholic is a person does this. It's an action. The action is you cross yourself. First, you may have seen this in movies or whatever. First your forehead, then your heart, then either side on your shoulders, and then you bring your hands together back in a prayer when you fold your hands in prayer. And it's a belief in three in one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's what that ritual is. That's a ritual. Sign of the cross is a ritual. It has action. It has objects, your hand, and it has words. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Or we used to say ghost. You see what I mean? How it changed? It used to be the Holy Ghost. But then somebody decided that ghost is not a good word. I like ghost. But there are also rituals outside of religion connected to culture, as we saw in our discussion. You kill a llama to fertilize the ground, right? And there's even more personal rituals. Jimmy loves coffee. I decided to give you one of my personal rituals. Every morning, I make 4 shots of espresso coffee in my Starbucks barista machine. This is one of the original barista machines that has one single thing before Starbucks went national. I remember when Starbucks sold these in their Starbucks stores because they were getting better machines. I bought one. It was one of the best investments. I've had it for years. Everybody says when I make an espresso, it's really, really good because you get the chocolate at the top. It's not chocolate, but it's foam. Anyway, I make these 4 shots the same way every morning. Every morning. Same way. I prepare the coffee maker by not only just turning it on, but running the water. I empty the grounds and refresh every time I make a new shot, and I make 4 shots. These are double. Every shot is a double. And then I wash the parts for the next morning, and then I'm ready to take my coffee and then go to work. I don't say anything while I'm doing this out loud, but I do recite in my head the things I'm doing. I don't say anything different. I just say, well, I gotta, and sometimes I'm thinking about work, and sometimes I'm thinking about reading with Jimmy, and sometimes I'm thinking about what I gotta do or whatever. But I take comfort in the smell of the coffee. So I have action, I have words, because I do. I look at it and I say to myself, that smells good. I don't say it out loud. Sometimes I do. I say it to the people around me. There's nobody around me. The ritual puts me in the right frame of mind. But I break that ritual every once in a while. Not because I don't have the time to do it, but I have to show myself that I can live without coffee. Have you ever gone off coffee if you're on a coffee like I am? I remember the first time I didn't drink coffee, besides being sick when you can't drink coffee. But I remember the first time I didn't have my morning coffee. By noon or 1 o'clock, I had the shakes. I got the shakes. Got the shakes. And I realized, crap, I had forgotten my coffee. So I had to go out and get a quick couple shots, and boom, 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 I was all right. Or I had to take a nap, and then I was. The community in the story was following a ritual. They don't know why they were doing it. So to them, maybe they didn't know it was a ritual. Even though the third person narrator tells us they had forgotten it was a ritual. The black blocks, the wood chips no longer being used, tell us it's a ritual because they remembered to use stones. And it's been going on for generations. And the longer a ritual is around, the more likely people don't remember why they're doing it. That's a fact. And I'm going to show you that. So time does that to things. The more you do it, right? Man gets used to everything, and you think, this is normal, right? You think, oh, everybody does this, so it must be normal. But it's not a ritual, because you're going to find out in a moment, or let me go right there right now. Sometimes a habit, let me highlight this. Sometimes a habit will look like a ritual, though all rituals are habits, but not all habits are rituals. We're going to explain that. Okay, the ritual I just described to you of my personal ritual of making coffee is just me. But I can guarantee you there's a lot of people out there that while they may not make coffee, they need their morning coffee or Coke, right? They have to have a Coca-Cola or something. Not Coke the drug, although some people do that. But don't do that. Don't do drugs. In any case, there's a lot of things about ritual. So how do you know you are doing a ritual? How do you know that? Repetition is one way. When you start repeating the same things, ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Well, wait a minute, Jimmy. If I knock on wood after I say something, I want to make sure, why do people knock on wood? Is that a ritual? That's kind of like a superstition, or not walking under a ladder or whatever. Those are superstitions. It's not a ritual. Action, remember, action, words, and things. Remember the 3 things? Actions, objects, and words, or words. So you can ask yourself, why am I doing this? That's how you start probing if you're doing a ritual. You can also ask if what you're doing means something beyond what you're doing. Deciding whether to keep or break a ritual is difficult unless you know what a ritual is. For example, not going to Thanksgiving dinner, tradition, ritual, Because, well, you find them boring. That's an interesting dilemma. I don't want to go to Thanksgiving anymore. Well, what's the effect of breaking that ritual will it have on everyone around you? If you stop doing that, what effect will that? You're breaking the ritual. When you break rituals, you cause commotion. When you keep rituals, you keep the peace, right? But when you keep rituals and you don't know the rituals, you become like this people in the Shirley Jackson story. You just don't even know why you're doing it. You just do it. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the secrets of this story, one of the secrets of life is if you should always try to know why you're doing what you're doing. Let me repeat that. You should always try to know why you're doing what you're doing. That's called knowing your motivation. Why do you do what you do? So the whole point of the lottery is to question rituals. That's really why, right? Would we be following them? Some are starting not to follow them, but clearly we don't know why it's being followed except for the clue. That's the only clue is Old Man Warner's comment. But these people clearly, from the third-person narrator, and imagine a third-person narrator in your life. Imagine if somebody was telling the story, me, Jimmy, the story of you, whoever you are. What would the third-person narrator be telling me about you? Well, if the third-person narrator were telling you about Jimmy, he would tell you when he woke up this morning, you already know what he's going to do because he does it every morning. That's his personal ritual. What is it? While it's true, a ritual can be your ritual. Rituals usually involve groups of people, right? Using objects, saying things. For example, and I'm going to use the Catholics again, the Mass. The Mass in Catholicism, it serves many purposes, but it's the whole Mass is a ritual. You go to Mass, you listen to sermons, you say prayers. Same thing in many, many, many different religions. You do things. You do these things that are called rituals. And within the rituals that is called in Catholicism is the Mass. And I don't want to get into specifics, but the Mass recreates the entire belief systems of that faith, for that faith. It does. All religions have such rituals, and even within a religion, there's different portions that may break off and form new rituals. For example, during the Renaissance, right, Luther broke off from the Catholic Church and started Lutheranism. And there's many, many different sects that broke off from Catholicism, from Catholics, right? So the Latin Mass, the Mass was originally in Latin, was used for centuries. Sounds like familiar with generations in the lottery, right? So the Latin was used because it was an international language of this Catholic ritual. In other words, the Mass, regardless of where you were in the world, before 1962. Wherever you were in the world, the Mass was the same. It was in Latin. The same things were done. The same objects were used. The same words were the same in Latin. Should I recite some? Because Jimmy was an altar boy. Right? Suscipia Dominus, sacra officium, de manibus tuis, alarme gloriam, nomine suis, ad utilitate, quoque nostram, totiusque, ecclesia sua sancta. That came right out of my memory, ladies and gentlemen. I did not have that. I did not have that Latin in front of me. It's in my head. And everybody knows what that is if you were doing Mass before 1962. Because the idea was to worship in a universal language. But the Second Vatican Council, which is a meeting of popes and cardinals, changed this rule. And instead, the Latin Mass was replaced with Mass in any language you want. Any language you want, right? Spanish, English, Portuguese, French, didn't matter. So no more universal language, pick a language, and you can have the Mass. Which is interesting, because once you change a ritual, there's a lot of commotion. I was an altar boy. When I was in grade school, I had memorized the Latin. I memorized Latin. Dominus vobiscum et cum spiritu tuo, right? Nunc dimittis, there it is. And I used to know what that stuff meant, but not anymore through lack of use. In fact, I studied Latin in high school. Father Lezak was my teacher. So, but it was also, even at that time, which also stopped as time. They didn't teach Latin anymore. They called it the dead language because nobody spoke it. Nobody spoke Latin. Romans spoke Latin, right? If you were going to read Caesar's Gallic Wars on this website one day, if not already, depending on when you're reading this, it was a dead language. Nobody read it anymore. So when things die, you forget about them. But even today, there's some people that insist on only having the Mass in Latin. They will not go unless it's in Latin. But when that happens, it actually caused me to break the ritual of Mass. I was in high school when that happened. I couldn't understand it. Why would you do that? There's a certain comfort, for example, in listening to Gregorian chants. Do you know what I'm talking about? If you never heard Gregorian chants, look them up and listen to them. Well, Jimmy, I did that like you said. I think I wrote your name. I got a couple of emails saying, "Oh, that sucks." Well, of course. That's what I mean about the variety of people and taste. And that's why you want to stick with classical literature. Classical literature helps you understand and appreciate things. Well, Jimmy, doesn't rap music have a certain... Of course it does, but it's not classical. Look up the word. So whether you keep or break rituals are deeply personal decisions, because that's what rituals should be. But remember, try to know why you're doing what you're doing. Why are you doing this? Because doing something you don't want to do is kind of like, right? Well, Jimmy, I read your civil disobedience. Are you saying Thoreau was wrong because he didn't want to pay his taxes? So he should do what only he wants to do. No, I'm saying that in society you have to follow rules. Otherwise you don't have a society, you have chaos. But a ritual is different. A ritual is connected with a symbol of doing something. Right? And it's important to discuss these things, just like it's important to discuss taxes. So I don't want to get into crowd psychology now, but some people who are not religious, atheists, they don't have a decision to make like this, like a ritual, because they don't believe in God, which is fine. Except that atheism itself is not a religion or belief system, but some rituals play an important role in atheistic circles. For example, atheists may feel compelled to go to a funeral for someone who does believe in God, right? Is that violating their role of being an atheist? I don't know. I have conversations with priests many times. I remember one guy in particular, he's a very smart, excellent priest. And I was talking to him about Zen, about Eastern philosophy and Confucius and Zen. And as I started to talk to him about it, he got nervous. He says, well, you can't really study that if you're a Catholic. You can't really believe in that. I said, well, I didn't say I believe in it, but I'm saying some of it makes a lot of sense. And he physically drew away from me. We were sitting having coffee. He physically backed up because he didn't want to have anything to do with it. Because according to Catholicism, you're not supposed to go to anybody else's quote unquote rituals. But Jimmy likes to understand things. And Jimmy is really not afraid of challenges in understanding his own rituals or understanding other people's rituals, right? You want to understand as much as you can. And then write your own stuff on your blackboard. Anyway, I don't want to get into it. The Lottery is a story about ritual that seems to shock people. Some looking at rituals have existed throughout time, and some of them are shocking. Aren't they? Aren't they shocking? I hope you enjoyed this classic story by Shirley Jackson and that you use it to help lead your life better by examining rituals. By the way, forget about stones, please. I don't want any stoning. Jimmy doesn't condone it. You've been reading with Jimmy, and this was the analysis of The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. If you have questions or comments, you can email me anytime, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, and be sure to explore our other novels and stories at www.readingwithjimmy.com. Thank you so much for hanging in there. Talk to you soon.